I think players who understand this end up winning way more games.
Right.
Distraction makers.
Okay, so we're going to talk about this idea that comes from economics called a negative negative externalities, which basically means that through one person's action or inaction, they sort of impose a negative consequence on another individual. Commander, basically, free-for-all multiplayer has this problem in general if it has any kind of direct interaction. So when we look at why players don't play removal, it's not just that it feels bad. It's not just that you're stopping somebody else from doing something. It's that you are actually actively hurting your chances to win the game by being the person who has the removal to use against someone else. Because you are spending card advantage, your resource, to take out somebody else's card, right? Especially if it's 1-for-1. You're spending one of your cards to take care of somebody else's one card, and there's two other players at the table, and those two players didn't do anything. And so effectively, you are hurting yourself as much as you're hurting the person that whose card you are removing.
In fact, this was a big turning point for me playing Commander, because when I started realizing that you could do this, I just basically, anytime that I had a board wipe in my hand, would hold it until like 2 or 3 other board wipes. And then, trying to pay attention to when other people are activating things so I can go, oh, sorry, guys, I don't got anything. Oh, man, I'm just a baby. I can't do anything.
Right, yeah. Sometimes this is referred to as small bean syndrome, which is, basically look like you're not a threat and then win the game out of nowhere. And this is just kind of one of the issues that we talk about with Commander in general is that because of this concept, negative externality, you are incentivized to not act. You are incentivized to let others act before you, to use their resources to your advantage, to not spend your own resources. And also you are incentivized to play in a way that makes it look like you're not doing much of anything because that way nobody else is incentivized to attack you. So there's another concept called omission bias, which means that people are much more likely to respond to harmful actions rather than harmful inaction. In Commander, this basically means that if someone is doing something that that doesn't harm you in particular, you're much less likely to think that what they're doing is a threat to you. And this comes up as like, you hear a lot of like incorrect threat assessment things. And it's not particularly helpful to sort of tell people like, well, you just don't know how to threat assess. Like, this is where that stuff comes from.
Not knowing how to threat assess is pretty useless when you just end up seeing someone that is just like, playing pass go or whatever, and they just have a bunch of cards in their hand. It's like, well, they could be a threat, I guess, but like, I don't know.
Right. It's not on the board.
Right.
And if I can't see it, I don't know what it is. It doesn't exist. It looks like they're way behind because they have like one thing on the board and a handful of cards, and they're drawing 5 more cards every turn.
It seems like they're probably a threat.
Yeah. And like, this is where Rhystic Study is kind of Rhystic Study is kind of one of the like poster cards of this issue, is that Rhystic Study is a much bigger threat than what people understand it to be, because it seems like it's not doing much of anything, right? To a newer player, they're like, oh, well, it's not adding a 10-10 to the board. They're just drawing an extra card sometimes when I play spells and I don't pay for it. So it leads players to not paying for it. It leads players to, again, just think it's sort of not a big deal. When Rhystic Study and cards like that, like Rhystic Study, are the ways that players end up winning the game because of this harmful inaction, where if it's harmful action, like a removal spell, players are much more likely to over-respond to that thing.
So this gets into player psychology, and something that we talk about fairly often is that games are, they simulate real life. In fact, a lot of games, most of the time, you can find some sort of a thing that connects back to, like, this is a visceral feeling that is natural to people. Not just people that play games, but people in general. It simulates a real-life experience. And I think that what you're talking about is people in general. It's something that happens with people, and it's psychology of humans, right? And so it is a thing. It's a thing to consider, and it's encouraging certain player behaviors. If designers don't want players to behave that way, then it's an issue. However, there's plenty of games that have this type of behavior, and it is encouraged. I think this type of behavior is encouraged in games like Civilization. It's encouraged in games like Risk, probably even Settlers of Catan. All free-for-all multiplayer games similar to Commander. I think it's just that Commander in general, because it's built off of a system that was not intended to be free-for-all multiplayer, as we talk about all the time, it ends up having these sort of negative player interactions that weren't initially encouraged by the designers.
I think what you're saying is true, and that's part of what we're talking about and part of the issues that are popping up. But I actually think that the big issue that I have with the situation that's unfolding is that the stated goal of Commander is subverted by this. Because the stated goal of Commander is that it is an inclusive, fun format, but you have a rule structure that incentivizes this type of behavior. When you have a player who is incentivized and wants to win the game, there are no mechanisms in the rule set to punish this type of behavior.
Right.
And so what ends up happening is you end up with a mismatch where this is just the best thing to do, is to do nothing, and the player that does the least is most likely to win.
Yeah.
And there's no mechanisms in the rules of Commander to change that scenario.
Right. And I mean, I think that's what I mean when I say I hesitate to call it an issue, though, is because in Commander's case, the game was not designed with this in mind. Other games can be designed and encourage this type of player behavior.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And want the game to revolve around that type of player psychology. But yeah, Commander has clearly shown, like what we've talked about all the time on here, is that like it's a teetering tower of ramshackled systems trying to hold up, the initial Magic system, and it doesn't work the same.
I think that's kind of the criticism here, right? And I think the thing for me that puts Commander in such a weird position is this. It's that, again, the stated goals of the design philosophies of Commander are completely contradictory to this play style that is most incentivized by the structures of the game.
Yes, the problem is that your stated goals as a designer, when you're designing a game, I know you know this, I'm talking to the people about this, all right? So when designing a game, your stated goals for that game they ideally should be stated and understood as you're developing the underlying systems of that game. Right. So even if they decided after the system was created, or let's say they even decided as they were developing Commander as a format, right, that was their goal. One, I don't even know if that early on in Magic, this was developed back in Legends when they first introduced legendary creatures. So I don't even know if that type of interaction was...
To be clear, I am taking the community's spoken objective of Commander as the design intent, and that could be incorrect.
I think that's what a lot of people do want. However, I do think like the only thing that you can do is build a mechanical structure with that intent on top of a system structure that cannot ever meet that intent.
Right.
And that's the problem.
Yep.
Because we see this. We've talked about the mechanics that we think actually encourage good behavior, or that kind of work around some of these systems, not good behavior.
Right. Let's clarify the systems mechanics again here, just to be able to follow along.
So systems being the underlying rules of
the operating system.
Operating system of game. Mechanics being how cards function, keywords, different interactions like that in the game itself. And so one mechanic that we really like is Monarch. Monarch is a mechanic that softly encourages players to go after a particular person. It turns it from a free-for-all game into a semi-optional 3 versus 1 game.
Well, and I think that this, the Monarch is, I think, attempting to solve some of this problem, right? And the Monarch comes from another Richard Garfield game. I think it's Vampire
something.
It's a vampire card game. I don't know. I'll put a picture of it up. And that game was a free-for-all multiplayer that had this as a way to sort of alleviate this problem.
Yeah, called the Edge mechanic.
The Edge, yeah. And King of Tokyo does some stuff kind of like this too in a different way.
Yep.
So you can kind of see Richard Garfield dancing around this problem with some of his games.
Yeah.
Right. So let me clarify a little bit on what I mean by this is the reason why Commander players don't play removal. It really comes down to the fact that if you do play removal and you don't understand this concept, that you are putting yourself at a disadvantage by playing removal, and it also feels bad. You basically are like, okay, well, I'm one for wanting this other person to take care of this problem, while somebody else isn't.
Yep.
And now that person, because of there's another concept here called action bias, which basically means that when somebody takes action against you, you're much more likely to take action against them, even if inaction is actually the right thing to do and most advantageous. So if someone takes any kind of action against you, attacks you, plays a spell against you, removes your thing, you are much more likely to come after that person, and probably even in subsequent games. Yeah. So, like, okay, we just played Commander the other night, and you had, I think, your Witherbloom deck, and you had a...
Bro, I got bullied so hard. Like 2 games in a row. Knocked out way before anyone else. I was not the threat.
You are a Commander player, aren't you?
Yeah. Is that believable?
That's pretty good.
Okay. This is something that we talk about. Cole Worley, who's the designer of Root. This is something that he talked about in his GDC talk on kingmaking. And a behavior that he actually wants to encourage players to have is a feeling that extends within the game, but also outside of the game, for players to have these sort of grudges, ideally playfully, not super antagonistic grudges. But
and we're not, we don't feel that way.
I fucking hate playing Commander with you guys. But on your point on something that you brought up that I think is really funny, and I think that like other games have done to get around this problem, especially free-for-all multiplayer games, is there's a lot of games that they'll end up having some sort of a mechanic or some sort of element in their system that, whether you meant to or not, you end up hurting someone. And a lot of the times that is because whoever throws the stone first, essentially, they'll take,
you have to come up with some way to force action.
You have to facilitate grudges, basically.
In Secret Hitler, this happens because at some point, you end up with 2 fascist policies and you don't have a choice. And the person's like, well, I didn't hand you 2 fascist, even if they did.
Right.
And so you end up with this forcing this sort of suspicion into the game.
And Catan has its thief, or its knight that moves the thief, that I think does the same exact thing, where it's no matter what, you have to move it. You could move it to a spot that you won't take someone's thing, but at certain points of the game, you're just bound to have it on a spot that someone is on, and you have to take a resource of theirs. And whether that person's really understanding, if they, in the future, get to move the thief to take someone else's resource, they're probably more than likely going to pick you because you picked them in the past.
Right. So I think the question then becomes, is this games are simulations of reality, right? Games are stories. Stories are also simulations of reality, abstracted reality, whatever. So the story that the rules of Commander are telling, I think, is in conflict a bit with what the players of Commander want Commander to be, or at least the vocal majority. I don't know. The vocal Commander players seem to have this idea that Commander is a casual, political focused game where these types of interactions, these are the interactions they're discussing. But I think, again, the issue that we come to is, okay, is the negative externalities that happen in these situations and the incentive to do nothing, is that actually what Commander players think that the game is? Right. Because if they don't, they are mistaken. Because that is what the rules and structure of Commander are incentivizing. And I think players who understand this end up winning way more games.
Right. Something that I think is actually really interesting, because I think people can make the argument that, so Magic is a great game on the surface, an incredible game once you peel back even further layers, right? It's a very layered game.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And the more that you get into the nitty-gritty parts of Magic, the more that you can start learning, various things. First things being like, oh, this is how much mana I should actually extend on the board, or this is, I don't want to overextend my hand. I need to look at my opponent's mana base and the cards in their hand and stuff like that. Like, you start to learn these things along the way. And I think that's what makes it very, very compelling for competitive players.
Right.
And I think that competitive players that like Commander and want to play CEDH probably really, really enjoy what you are talking about.
Sure.
Because that is viewed as that like layered look at the game, and how you actually become better at the game is this way. And I don't think it's like, in my opinion, I don't think of it necessarily as an issue so much as a conflict of design philosophies.
I also so the thing that you're bringing up I think is really interesting, because I do think that there is a problem in how this concept is able to be seen, right? Because when you're playing 1v1 Magic, the heuristics and the strategies are something that you as an individual can you can notice, but like maybe not completely wrap your head around until you're sort of reading articles or somebody's explaining it to you. But like you can at least put the clues together. Where this in Commander is much harder to notice on your own. Like,
yeah,
you're literally going, this person's not doing anything.
Did they draw a bad hand?
Right.
Can they not play anything?
And that could be true.
And also,
right?
that's what I would say.
It's
I would just lie.
Right. Exactly. You're incentivized to do that. And like, that I think is part of the weirdness, is like, okay, well, I don't want to feel like a bad person, so that person's not really playing much of anything, so I'm not going to attack them. You know, we're going to play it, you know, okay, maybe I'll give them a little time to see if they like, you know, can draw some more creatures to play or something, even though they're literally just like on purpose doing nothing.
Yeah.
So
basically, it benefits you to be the whiniest person at the table.
Yeah.
And you just complain nonstop. That's not true, actually. I played a game a few weeks ago that the whiniest person, he ended up being the only person that someone destroyed their lands. He was screwed. He was mana screwed.
Yeah.
Turn 6, he finally drew his third land.
Somebody blew it up?
And someone blew it up. Because it was a tapped land, so it had to come and tap.
No.
And then, or got around. He was whining enough, and then the guy was like, you.
Oh my God. This is also funny because like land destruction is part of what we're talking about too, is that when players feel like they don't want to play removal, they don't want to play interaction with their opponents, things that normally need to be interacted with because they're cards that are built in a way that makes them win the game, first of all, but also a buildup of value over time, something like Field of the Dead or something, right? Which is a land that whenever I think you get a certain number of lands, and then whenever you do something, you get a 2/2 zombie, and it just ends up taking over the game. And like that's a card that needs to be, it's a land. The only way you can remove it is with land destruction. But land destruction is seen as such a taboo that nobody wants to run land destruction, because in other instances, it's a dead card, because you're not going to blow up somebody's tap land, right? When they're mana screwed. Normally you wouldn't do that, right?
Normally, no one would be that evil.
But I think that, you know, you brought up something about the lessons that players are taking away from playing the game.
Yeah. And
I think that's a really important thing to talk about, and something that I think about a lot in terms of like the way that I'm designing a system, the way I'm designing a game, is what's the feeling that I want the player left with at the end here, and the thing that, you know, not necessarily the lesson, but like what's the scenario that I want them to walk through to potentially learn something from. I think to me, the interactions that happen in Commander, they do teach you lessons, right? You take away something from playing the game.
Right.
And I think that the lesson ends up sort of being in the inverse, which is that there might be people who look like they're doing nothing, but they are reaping the benefits of something you're doing.
Right. So
be on the lookout for them.
Hold up. I don't know, gain as much power and money as you can, and maybe you'll win in the end.
Maybe. Okay, well, you got anything else?
Negatory extremities.
Mm-hmm.
Negatory extremities are good or bad.